Good morning. It's Monday, and I hope you had a great weekend. I did not read the last chapter when I read with you on Friday. So I'm going to start today at chapter 25. In my book, it's on page 157, or whatever page chapter 25 is on, go to that page, please, and I'll finish reading chapter 25, and then we'll read chapters 26 um, through the end of the book, and then on tomorrow we'll read the author's note. So on chapter 25, it starts out with, the Aleuts never again came to the island of the Blue Dolphins, but every summer I watched for them, and every early spring I gathered shellfish, which I dried and stored in the cave where I kept my canoe. 2 winters after they left, I made more weapons, a spear, a bow, a quiver of arrows. Those I also stored in the place beneath the headland. So if the hunters returned, I would be ready to go to another part of the island to move from cave to cave, living in my canoe if necessary. For many summers after the Aleuts had gone, the herd of otter left Coral Cove. The old otter, which had survived the Aleut spears and by now were aware that summer was a time of danger, would lead the herd away. They went far off to the kelp beds of the tall rock where they stayed until the first storms of winter. Often, Rontu and I would go out to the rock and live there for several days, watching fish for Wanani and others I had come to know, catching fish, excuse me. One summer, the otter did not leave, the summer that Rantu died, and I knew then that none of the otter who remembered the hunters were left, nor did I think of them often, nor of the white men who said they would come back but did not come. Until that summer, I had kept count of all the moons since the time my brother and I were alone on the island. For each one that came and went, I cut a mark on a pole beside the door of my house. There were many marks from the roof of the floor. But after that summer, I did not cut them anymore. The passing of the moons now had come to mean little, and I only made marks to count the 4 seasons of the year. This last year, I did not count those. It was late in the summer that Rontu died. The day since spring, whenever I went to the reef to fish, he would not go with me unless I urged him to. He liked to lie in the sun in front of the house, and I let him, but I did not go so often as in the past. I remember the night that Rontu stood at the fence and barked for me to let him out. Usually he did this when the moon was big, and he came back in the morning, but that night there was no moon and he did not return. I waited all day for him, almost dusk, and then I went to look for him. I saw his tracks and followed them over the dunes and hill to the lair where he had once lived. There I found him, lying on the back of the cave, alone. At first I thought he had been hurt, yet there were no wounds on him. He touched my hand with his tongue, but only once, and he was quiet and scarcely breathed. Since night had fallen and it was too dark for me to carry Rontu back, I stayed there. I sat beside them through the night and talked to him. At dawn, I took him in my arms and left the cave. He was very light, as if something about him had already gone. The sun was up and I went along the cliff. Gulls were crying in the sky. He raised his ears at the sound, and I put him down, thinking that he wished to bark at them as he always did. He raised his head and followed them with his eyes, but he did not make a sound. Rontu, I said, you have always liked to bark at the seagulls. Whole mornings and afternoons you have barked at them. Bark at them now for me. But he did not look at them again. Slowly he walked to where I was standing and fell at my feet. I put my hand on his chest. I could feel his heart beating. It beat only once, very slowly, loud and hollow like the waves on the beach, and then no more. Rontu, I cried. Oh, Rontu. I buried him on the headland. I dug a hole in the crevice of the rock, digging for 2 days from dawn until going down of the sun, and I put him there with some sand flowers and a stick he liked to chase when I threw it, and I covered him with pebbles of many colors, and I gathered on the shore. I'm actually glad I didn't read this on Friday. I don't know if I could have stopped for the weekend. That winter, I did not go to the reef at all. I ate the things I had stored and I left the house only to get water at the spring. It was a winter of strong winds and rain and wild seas that crashed against the cliffs, so I could not have gone out much even if Rontu had been there. During that time, I made 4 snares from notched branches. In the summer, once when I was on my way to the place where the sea elephants lived, I had seen a young dog that looked like Rontu. He was running with one of the packs of wild dogs, and though I caught only a glimpse of him, I was sure he was Rontu's son. He was larger than the other dogs and had heavier fur and yellow eyes, and he ran with a gleeful stride like Rontu's. In the spring, I planned to catch him with the snares I was making. The wild dogs came to the headland often during the winter. Now that Rontu was gone, and when the worst of the storms were over, I set snares outside the fence and baited them with fish. I caught several of the dogs the first time, but not the one with the yellow eyes. And since I was afraid to handle them, I was forced to let them free. I made more snares and set these again, but while the wild dogs came close, they would not touch the fish. I did catch a little red fox, which bit me when I took her out of the snare, yet she soon got over her wildness and would follow me around the yard, begging for abalone. She was very much a thief. When I was away from the house, she always found some way to get into the food, no matter how well I hid it, so I had to let her go to the back of the ravine. Often, though, she would come at night and scratch at the fence for food. I could not catch the young dog with the snare, and I was about to give up trying when I thought of tulash weed, which we sometimes use to catch fish in the tide pools. It was not really poison, but if you put it in the water, the fish would turn over on their backs and float. I remembered this weed, and dug some where it grew on the far side of the island. I broke it up into small pieces, which I dropped in the spring where the wild dogs drank. I waited all day, and at dusk the pack came down to the spring. They drank their fill of the water, but nothing happened to them, or not much. They frisked around for a while as I watched them from the brush and trotted away. And then I remembered Juchal. Some of the men of our tribe used it and made from ground up seashells and wild tobacco. I made a big bowl of this, mixing it with water, and put it in the spring. I hid in the brush and waited. The dogs came at dusk. They sniffed the water and backed off and looked at each other, but at last began to drink, and soon afterwards they began to walk around in circles, and suddenly they all lay down and went to sleep. There were 9 of them lying there by the spring. In the dim light, it was hard to tell the one I wanted to take home, but I finally found him. He was snoring as if he had just eaten a big meal. I picked him up and carried him along the cliff, being frightened all the way that he would wake up before I reached the headland. I pulled him through the opening under the fence and tied him to it with a thong and left food beside it for him to eat and some fresh water. And before long, he was on his feet, gnawing through the thong, and he howled and ran about the yard while I cooked my supper. All night he howled, but at dawn, when I went out of the house, he was asleep. When he lay there by the fence sleeping, I thought of all the different names for him, trying first one and then another, saying them over to myself. At last, because he looked so much like his father, I decided to call him Rantu Aru, which means son of Rantu. In a short time, he made friends with me. He was not so large as Rantu, but he had his father's thick coat and the same yellow eyes. And often when I watched him chasing gulls on the sand spit or on the reef barking at the otter, I forgot that he was not Rantu. We had many happy times that summer, fishing and going to Tall Rock in our canoe, but more and more I thought of Chutak and my sister Ulape. Sometimes I would hear their voices in the wind, and often when I was on the sea in the waves that lapped softly against the canoe. After the fierce storms of winter came many days when the wild wind did not blow. The air was so heavy that it was hard to breathe, and the sun so hot that the sea was like a sun itself, too bright to look at. The last day of this weather, I took the canoe from the cave and paddled around the reef to the sand spit. I did not take Rontu Aru with me, for while he liked the cold, he did not like the heat. It was good that he did not come with me. The day was the hottest of all, and the sea shimmered with red light. Over my eyes, I wore shields made of wood with small slits in them to see through. No gulls were flying. The otter lay quiet in the kelp, and the little crabs were deep in their holes. I pulled the canoe up on the beach, which was wet but steaming from the sun. Every early spring, I took the canoe to the sand spit and spread fresh pitch in the cracks that needed it. I worked all of this morning, stopping from time to time to cool off in the sea. And as the sun climbed high, I turned the canoe over and crawled under it and went to sleep in the shade. I had not slept long when I was suddenly awakened by what I thought was thunder, but upon looking out from my shelter, I saw that there were no clouds in the sky. Yet the rumbling sound kept on. It came from a distance, from the south, and as I listened, it grew louder. I jumped to my feet, and the first thing that caught my gaze was the gleaming stretch of beach on the southern slope of the sand spit. Never in my life on the island had I seen this height so low. Rocks and small reefs that I did not know were under the sea stood bare in the blinding light. It was like another place. I had gone to sleep and wakened on another island. The air was suddenly tight around me, and there was a faint sound as if some giant animal were sucking the air in through its teeth. The rumbling came closer out of an empty sky, filling my ears. And then beyond the gleam of the beach and the bare rocks and the reefs, more than a league beyond them, I saw a great white crest moving down upon the island. It seemed to move slowly between the sea and the sky, but it was the sea itself. I tore off the shields I wore over my eyes, and in terror I ran along the sand spit. I ran and stumbled and got up and ran again. The sand shuddered under my feet as the first wave struck. Spray fell around me like rain, and it was filled with pieces of kelp and small fish. By following the curve of the sand spit, I could reach the cove and the trail that led to the mesa, but there was no time for this. Water was already rushing around my knees, pulling from every direction. The cliff rose in front of me as though the rocks were slippery and with sea moss. I found a hold for a hand and then a foot, and thus a step at a time I dragged myself upward. The crest of the wave passed under me and roared on toward Coral Cove, and for a time there was no sound. And then the sea began to seek its old place, running backward in long, foaming currents. And before it could do so, another great wave moved out of the south, and perhaps it would be even bigger than the first one. I looked up. The cliff rose straight above me. I could climb no farther. I stood facing the rock with my feet on a narrow ledge and my hand thrust deep into a crack. Over my shoulder, I could see the wave coming. It did not come fast, for the other wave was still running out. For a while, I thought that it would not come at all because the two suddenly met behind or beyond the sand spit. The first wave was trying to reach the sea, and the second one was struggling toward the shore. Like two giants, they crashed against each other. They rose high in the air, bending first one way and then the other. There was a roar as if the great spears were breaking in battle, and a red light of the sun and spray that flew around them looked like blood. Slowly, the second wave forced the first one backward, rolling slowly over it, and then as a victor drags the vanquished, moved in toward the island. The wave struck the cliff. It sent long tongues streaming around me so that I could neither see nor hear. The tongues of water licked into all the crevices, dragged at my hand and at my bare feet, gripping the ledge. They rose high above me along the face of the rock, up, and then spent themselves against the sky and fell back, hissing past me to join the water rushing on toward the cove. Suddenly, all around me was quiet, and in the quiet I could hear my heart pounding, and I knew that my hand still had its hold on the rock and that I was alive. Night came, and though I was afraid to leave the cliff, I knew that I could never stay there until morning, that I would go to sleep and fall. Neither could I find my way home, so I climbed down from the ledge and crouched at the foot of the cliff. Dawn was windless and hot. The sand spit was strewn with hills of kelp. Dead fish and lobsters and pink crabs lay everywhere, and two small whales were stranded against the rocks of the cove. Far up the trail that led to the mesa, I found things from the sea. Rontu was waiting at the fence, and when I crawled under it, he jumped upon me and followed me around, never letting me out of his sight. I was glad to be home on the high headland where the waves had not come. I had been gone only from one sun to the next, yet it was like many suns, like the time I had gone away in the canoe. Most of the day I slept, but I had many dreams, and when I awoke, everything around me was strange. The sea made no sounds on the shore. The gulls were quiet. The earth seemed to be holding its breath as though it were waiting for something terrible to happen. At dusk, I was coming back from the spring with a basket of water on my shoulder, walking along the cliff with Rontu. Everywhere the ocean was smooth and yellow, and it lay against the island as if it were very tired. The gulls were still quiet, perched on their rocky nests, and slowly the earth began to move. It moved away from my feet, and for a moment I seemed to be standing in air. Water tipped out of the basket and trickled over my face, and then the basket fell on the ground. Not knowing what I did, thinking foolishly that another wave was upon me, I began to run. But it was not, but it was a wave, a wave of earth, and it rippled under me along a cliff. As I ran, another wave overtook me. Looking back, I saw many of them coming out of the south like waves in the sea. The next thing I remember, I was lying on the ground and Ranchu was beside me, and we were both trying to get to our feet. And then we were running again toward the headland, toward a house that kept moving off in the distance. The opening under the fence had caved in, and I had to pull the rocks away before we could crawl through. Night came, but the earth still rose and fell like a great animal breathing. I could hear rocks tumbling from the cliff, falling down into the sea. All night as we lay there in the house, the earth trembled and the rocks fell, yet not the big one on the headland, which would have fallen if those who make the world shake had really been angry with us. In the morning, the earth was quiet once more, and a fresh wind that smelled like kelp blew out of the northern sea. The earthquake did little damage. Even the spring, which had failed to flow for several days, started up again and flowed more than ever. But the great waves had cost me all the food and weapons which were stored in the cave, as well as the canoe I had been working on and those hidden under the south cliffs. The canoes were the biggest loss. To find enough wood to make another would have taken me all spring and summer. I therefore set out on the first fair morning to search for whatever wreckage the waves had washed ashore. Among the rocks near the south cliffs, I found part of one canoe buried in sand and twisted kelp. I worked all morning to dig it free, and then having scraped it clean, could not decide what to do. I could cut the sinews and carry the planks up the cliffs 2 at a time on my back and across the dunes to Coral Cave, which meant many days. Or I could build the canoe here on the rocks and take the chance that another storm would wash it away before I was finished. I finally did neither of these things, choosing a day when the sea was calm. I floated what was left of the canoe and pushing it in front of me, made my way past the sand spit into the cove. There I took the wreckage apart and moved the planks up the trail beyond the place where the great waves had reached. I found the remains of my other canoe. It had been washed far back in the cave and I could not get it out. So I went back to the south cliffs and hunted among the piles of kelp until I had enough pieces of wood, counting what I already had, to begin the building of another. It was late in the spring now. The weather was still unsettled with light rain falling most of the days, but I started the new canoe anyway, for I needed it to gather shellfish. No longer did I think of the Aleuts, as I have said, yet without a canoe to go where I wanted, I felt uneasy. The planks were all about the same size, the length of my arm, but they came from different canoes and were therefore hard to fit together. The holes were ready, however, which saved me much labor and time. Another help that was another help was that the great waves had washed ashore long strings of black pitch, which were often difficult to find on the island and which I needed. When I had sorted out the planks and shaped them, the work went fast, so that by late spring, I was ready to finish the seams. It was on a windy morning that I made my fire to soften the pitch. The wind was cold and it took a long time to get the fire going. To hasten it, I went down to the beach for dry seaweed. I had started back with my arms filled when I turned to look at the sky, thinking from the feel of the wind that a storm might be close. Off to the north, the skies were clear, but in the east, from whence storms sometimes came at this season, stood banks of gray clouds, one on top of the other. At this moment, in the deep shadows cast by the clouds, I saw something else. Forgetting that I was carrying a load of seaweed, I threw up my arms and the seaweed fell to the ground. A sail, a ship was there on the sea, halfway between the horizon and the shore. By the time I had reached the headland, it was much closer, moving quickly on the strong wind. I could see that it did not have a red beaked prow of the Aleuts, nor did it look like the white men's ship, which I clearly remembered. Why had it come to the island of the Blue Dolphins? I crouched on the headland and wondered, my heart beating fast, if the men who sailed it had come to catch I wondered if the men who sailed it had come to catch otter. If they were hunters, I must hide before they saw me. They would soon find my fire and the canoe I was making, yet I could go to the cave and probably be safe from them. But if they had been sent by my people to take me away, then I should not hide. The ship moved slowly between the black rocks into the coral cove, and I could see the men now, and they were not Aleuts. They lowered a canoe, and 2 of the men paddled toward the beach. The wind had begun to blow hard, and the men had trouble landing. And finally, one of them stayed behind in the canoe, and the other, a man without a beard, jumped into the water and came along the beach and up the trail. I could not see him, but after a while I heard a shout and then another, and I knew that he had found my fire and the canoe. The man he had left in the cove did not answer, nor did the men on the ship, so I was sure he was calling to me. I crawled down from the rock and went to the house. Since my shoulders were bare, I put on my otter cape. I took my cormorant skirt and the abalone box in which I kept my necklace and earrings. With Rontu Aru, I then went along the trail that led to Coral Cove. I came to the mound where my ancestors had sometimes camped in the summer, and I thought of them and of the happy time spent in my house on the headland of my canoe lying unfinished in the trail. I thought of many things, but stronger was the wish to be where people lived, to hear their voices and their laughter. I left the mound and the green grass growing on it among the white shells. I could no longer hear the man calling, so I began to run. And when I came to the place where the two trails met, where I had built my fire, I found the footsteps of the man had left. I followed them down to the cove. The canoe had gone back to the ship. The wind was screaming now, and the mist blew in across the harbor, and waves began to pile up on the shore. I raised my hand and shouted. I shouted over and over, but the wind carried my voice away. I ran down to the beach and waded in the water. The men did not see me. Rain started to fall, and the wind drove against my face. I waded farther out through the waves, raising my arms to the ship, and slowly it moved away in the mist. It went toward the south. I stood there until it was out of sight. After two more springs had gone, on a morning of white clouds and calm seas, the ship came back. At dawn, I saw it from the headland far out on the horizon, and when the sun was overhead, it lay anchored in Coral Cove. Until the sun went down, I watched the headland while the men made a camp on the shore and built a fire, and then I went to my house. All night, I did not sleep, thinking of the man who once had called to me. I had thought of his voice calling for a long time, since the night of the storm when the ship had sailed away. Every day during those two springs and two summers, I had gone to the headland and watched, always at dawn and again at dusk. In the morning, I smelled the smoke from their fire, and I went down to the ravine and bathed in the spring and put on my otter cape and my cormorant skirt. I put on the necklace of black stones and the black earrings. With blue clay, I made the mark of our tribe across my nose. Then I did something that made me smile at myself. I did what my older sister Eulape had done. When she left the island of the Blue Dolphins, below the mark of our tribe, I carefully made a sign which meant I was still unmarried. I was no longer a girl, yet I made it anyway, using the blue clay and some of the white clay for the dots. I went back to the house and then built a fire and cooked food for Rontu, Aru, and me. I was not hungry. He ate my food and his too. We are going away, I said to him, away from our island. But he only put his head to one side, as his father had often done. And when I said no more, he trotted out to a sunny place and lay down and fell asleep. Now that the white men had come back, I could not think of what I would do when I went across the sea, or make a picture in my mind of the white men and what they did there, or see my people who had been gone so long. Nor thinking of the past or the many summers and winters and springs that had gone, could I see each of them? They were all one, a tight feeling in my breast and nothing more. The morning was full of sun, and the wind smelled of the sea and the things that lived in it. I saw the men long before they saw the house on the headland, far off on the dunes in the south. There were three of them, two tall men and one who was short, who wore a long gray robe. They left the dunes and came along a cliff, and then seeing the smoke from the fire which I kept burning, they followed it. At last they reached my house. I crawled under the fence and stood facing them. The man in the gray robe had a string of beads around his neck, and at the end of it was an ornament of polished wood. He raised his hand and made a motion toward me, which was the shape of the ornament he wore. And then one of the two men who stood behind him spoke to me. His words made the strangest sounds I have ever heard. At first I wanted to laugh, but I bit my tongue. I shook my head and smiled at him. He spoke again slowly this time, and though his words sounded the same as before and meant nothing to me, they now seemed sweet. They were the sound of human voice. There was no sound like this in all the world. The man lifted his hand and pointed toward the cove and made a picture in the air of what could have been a ship. To this I nodded, and myself, excuse me, I nodded and myself pointed to the 3 baskets I had placed by the fire, making a gesture of taking them with me to the ship. Also, the cage in which I had put the 2 young birds. There were many gestures before we left, though the 2 men spoke among themselves. They liked my necklace, the cape, and the cormorant skirt that shone in the sun. But when we got to the beach where their camp was, the first thing the man who spoke the most did was tell the other men to make me a dress. I knew this was what he had said because one of them stood in front of me and held up a string from my neck to my feet across my shoulders. The dress was blue. It was made of 2 trousers, just like those the white men were wearing. The trousers were cut up into pieces, and then one of the men sat on a rock and put them together again with a white string. He had a long nose, which looked like the needle he used. He sat all afternoon on the rock, and the needle went back and forth, in and out, flashing in the sun. From time to time, he would hold up the dress and nod his head as if he were pleased. I nodded as if I was pleased too, but I was not. I wanted to wear my cormorant skirt and my otter cape, which was much more beautiful than the thing he was making. The dress reached from my throat to my feet, and I did not like it, either the color of it or the way it scratched. It was also hot. But I smiled and put my cormorant skirt away in one of the baskets to wear when I got across the sea, sometime when the men were not around. The ship stayed in Coral Cove 9 days. The ship stayed in Coral Cove for 9 days. It had come for Otter, but the otter had gone. Some must have been left after all, who remembered the Aleuts, for on that morning there were none to be found. I knew where they had gone. They had gone to Tall Rock, but when the men showed me the weapons they had brought to kill Otter, I shook my head and acted as though I did not understand. They pointed to my otter cape, but I still shook my head. I asked them then about the ship that had taken my people away many years ago, making signs of the ship and pointing east, but they did not understand. Not until I came to the mission Santa Barbara did Father Gonzalez and met Father Gonzalez did I learn from him that this ship had sunk in a great storm soon after it reached his country, and that on the whole ocean thereabouts there was no other. For this reason, the white men had not come back for me. On the 10th day we sailed. It was a morning of blue skies and no wind. We went straight toward the sun. For a long time I stood and looked back at the island of the Blue Dolphins. The last thing I saw of it was the high headland. I thought of Rontu laying there beneath the stones of many colors, and of Wanani, wherever she was, and the little red fox that would scratch in vain at my fence, and my canoe hidden in the cave, and of all the happy days. Dolphins rose out of the sea and swam before the ship. They swam for many leagues in the morning through the bright water, weaving their foamy patterns. The little birds were chirping in their cage, and Rontu Aru sat beside me. That's the end of the book, except the author's note, which we will want to read tomorrow because it does kind of tell you about what happened after this story was written. So I will read that with you tomorrow, and I hope you have a great day.